Nintendo is a company that I have basically supported for as long as I can remember, and because of that I have mainly played Nintendo games on Nintendo consoles. But of course I did have some other non-Nintendo things, like I had a PlayStation 1 for maybe like an hour some years ago, and then more recently I had gotten myself a Sega Genesis Mini. But I wouldn't really count it as like a true console, since it's a mini console and it just has ROMs on it, which you can also just buy a collection for, something like the Switch. But in terms of real consoles, well, not too long ago I decided to add a new console to my collection, and that console is the Xbox Series S, which is an all-out digital console released in late 2020. And well, today I wanted to talk about this console and why I bought it and why I think this is a great little console, especially if you're a Nintendo fan that just wants a bit more oomph in their games. And well, that's what this video is gonna be about. So why don't we start off this year by rolling that intro and let's talk about the Xbox Series S. So to start off, we're first gonna be taking a look at the console itself. So the Xbox Series S is a relatively small console. In fact, it is currently the smallest Xbox yet. In fact, it is small enough that you can fit the entire console plus the controller and cables that came along with the console all in one backpack, which is pretty crazy. But of course you could also do this with the Switch, and since the Switch is made to be brought to other places, I just think it's a lot cooler that you can just put your Xbox and the accessories in a backpack and bring it with you. Even though it is not as practical as the Switch, in that way it is still cool. Which the same goes for the design of the console, which yeah, it is very small, but it also looks very different compared to the Series X. In fact, the Series S more so resembles the look of an Xbox One, but unlike the Xbox One, the Series S is a bit more unique in a bunch of different ways. Like, you can set it up like a flat console, which I really like, but you can also set it up on its side, which also looks kinda nice. But I do prefer the console laying down more, since the startup button looks a lot more natural this way, since well, the startup button looks like the Xbox logo, and so far I know you cannot rotate the button unless you open up your console and rotate it, which I'm just not gonna do. Then there's also the controller that came bundled in with the console, and wow, I immediately fell in love with it right after I picked it up out of its plastic bag. So first of all, this controller actually has some weight to it, which I really like, but I definitely had to get used to it, since I'm used to how light the Joy-Cons of the Switch are, and the only other controller I use on the Switch is this Isabelle controller by PowerA, which is so light that even something as light as a pack of pens might be a bit heavier than that Isabelle controller. But besides that, this is a really solid controller. The buttons feel nice, and the same goes for the sticks and the texture of the outer shell of it. But there's one thing I don't really like about it, and that is that the controller doesn't have a battery pack installed in it. Meaning that you need to use batteries and put them in the controller in order for it to work. But luckily there are some batteries included, so you can at least use the controller for a while. But at some point you either have to get some new batteries, or you could buy a battery pack. Or if you're like me, you could go over with option C, which is to plug a USB-C cable in the controller, which just turns the wireless controller into a wired controller, which I'm also pretty used to, since that Isabelle controller I mentioned earlier is also a wired controller. So, now that we looked at the physical side of this digital only console, we can now take a look at the digital side. So first off, I wanted to take a look at what is in my opinion the biggest reason why I want to get an Xbox, and that is the Game Pass. So the Xbox Game Pass, for the people who don't know, is a subscription you can get for Xbox, which just like Nintendo Switch Online gives you free games. The only difference is that with Game Pass you actually get a better variety of games, since not only are there old games on it, but you also get a ton of new games with it. And even some games get put on the Game Pass on the release day, which is pretty crazy if you ask me. Especially since some of these are actually pretty big titles, like Halo Infinite's campaign was available on Game Pass the same day as the retail release of it, which is crazy. The only downside to the Game Pass is that it doesn't give you the ability to play online. For that you will need to get Xbox Live Gold, meaning that Xbox has two kinds of subscriptions you can get, but it's in my opinion worth it, since well, you do get a pretty good online experience, and the games, well, there are a ton of them. And of course, games people are interested in also become available through the Game Pass. Also, you can just test out games, and if you don't like them, you can just delete them and play something else instead, which I think is pretty smart. But of course, the most important thing about getting a new console is of course seeing how games run on that system. And well, if you're mainly playing games on Switch and thinking about getting a Series S, you will get a serious boost in performance in games. Especially in games like Fortnite, where if you just compare both the Xbox and the Switch to each other, it's pretty noticeable that the Xbox just looks a lot cleaner. And it's not just in looks, it's also in performance, since if we look up here, we can see the Series S getting a pretty solid 60 FPS on Fortnite, while the Switch stays at a somewhat consistent 30 FPS. Well, with that little test we can clearly see how much of a difference the quality is between these two consoles. Another thing that is also really different compared to these two consoles is the non-gaming stuff you can do with them. Of course, I'm talking about another very popular form of media, and that is watching videos and shows. And well, both consoles do have some stuff you can watch, like the Switch has YouTube, Twitch, Pokemon TV, and in some countries Hulu. And the Series S, well, it has YouTube, Twitch and Hulu, and practically every other kind of TV app you might need. Netflix, Crunchyroll, Disney+, and you can even buy some shows. But not Pokemon TV, which is kinda obvious. But you can also just go on the web browser on the Xbox and watch it through there. So technically, the Series S has way more to offer in terms of video watching, you could say. But on Switch you do get the benefit to play and watch stuff in different places, so at least it got that going for itself. But just knowing that the Series S has way more to offer makes me just wanna use that instead of the Switch. Also, I'm someone who mainly watches YouTube, and also I prefer using my PC or phone for that, so I don't really use my Switch for that. But I do like that for the people who use the Switch for YouTube, it is an opportunity for when they feel like watching some stuff. But speaking of PC, it is actually possible to use the Series S as a PC, since the console does support the use of mouse and keyboard, and which is not just in the menu, since a bunch of games like the FNAF series, Fortnite and Roblox do actually support the use of both mouse and keyboard, which in my opinion is quite nice if I do say so myself. But that's not the only PC thing you can do with the console, since if we go over to the Microsoft Edge web browser, we get access to the Microsoft Office services, meaning that it is 100% possible to make a PowerPoint presentation on a console, which I just find funny. But now, I think it is time to compile all of the things I talked about in this video and give my final verdict on the sleek looking console. So, in my opinion, the Xbox Series S is a must buy if you're looking for a cheap but great gaming system, since not only does it provide you with games that will look and run great, you also have the extra benefit of the Xbox Game Pass and of course the possibility to use it as a somewhat budget PC with the web browser and the mouse and keyboard support. And don't forget all the other stuff, like the subscription services that are available, the cloud gaming, and of course the most important thing, ray tracing, that will at some point come out for the console editions of Minecraft Bedrock. And well, the only real downside I can see with this console is that it can't read discs and that there's currently only one color available for this console, which is white, which I don't really like. But hey, at least it can run Roblox. But yeah, if you're thinking about buying a console, I highly recommend the Series S, which should currently also be pretty easy to find. So, if you would all excuse me now, I'm gonna be playing the widescreen Xbox port of Banjo-Kazooie, which with me being a Nintendo fanboy, it is kinda crazy that I've never played it. So, I guess I will see you all later.